Hello everyone. I'm Renaud Evrard, a clinical psychologist in France, associate professor of psychology at the University of Lorraine. Here in France, we often use the Rorschach Inkblot test for clinical or research purpose. So I decided to explore it overlap with the field of parapsychology. The Rorschach has been used sometime by Gertrude Schmeidler. And she published a monograph on ESP in relation to Rorschach test evaluation in 1960. And the Rorschach test have hardly been associated with parapsychology since. Yet our results were very promising. Gertrude Schmeidler is very famous for having established experimentally the chip growth effect. She wanted to analyze other personality factors which could be associated with ESP, but direct answers to straightforward questions taken literally will describe only conscious factors. To bypass this obstacle, she explored several projective methods and put a greatest emphasis on the Rorschach test, where more than 1,000 protocols were obtained, mainly with college students. She was fully aware of the controversy regarding this tool, but on her own estimate, the test is excellent when wisely handled. She used mainly a group method of administration. Slides representing the Rorschach cards were exposed in a darkened room, and subjects were instructed to write their responses to those slides. But she had to complete the protocol through time-consuming individual interviews. 3 hypotheses are supported at a level of significance greater than p equal 0.001. First hypothesis is that sheep will tend to have higher ISP score than goats. Second hypothesis is that this tendency will be more pronounced for subjects whose social adjustment is good than for those whose social adjustment is poor. That is to say that socially well-adjusted sheep will have higher ISP scores than poorly adjusted sheep, while socially well-adjusted goats will have lower ISP scores than poorly adjusted goats. And last, the tendency will be more pronounced for subjects who do not show signs of marked inhibition or of marked over-responsiveness. She identifies 6 things regarding this profile, but this is quite technical for people who don't know the Rorschach test. But in fact, it's the number of responses, 30, the number by form, more than half of the human movements response were characterized by rigidity. This is another aspect. There is the criteria of total movement, the criteria of no shock, because sometimes people react very strangely to some of the slides. And the last item is the color form responses. They have 2 or 3 strong or warm color form responses. And I asked one of my colleagues specialized in the Rorschach test, and he told me that some of these signs are already found in some of the textbook of Didier Anzieux in France or Schaeffer in US to describe either hysterical neurosis or sign of obsessive neurosis. But this is not the point. What she found later is that she was even able to successfully predict the direction of ESP scores on the basis of personality tendencies diagnosed from the subject Rorschach protocols. And later with LeShan, they demonstrated that subjects with high ESP scores show more penetration responses, another kind of response, in relation to their barrier responses. So subjects with score that stay near chance had a higher ratio of barrier responses, and the difference between both was significant. So this finding was later integrated in the theory of thinness of psychic boundaries, assessed at that time through questionnaires, but not with projective tools anymore. I looked into the whole parapsychological literature and was unable to find any work comparable to that of Gertrude Schmeidler. There are some things by Lorraine's who use Rorschach tests with nursery school children in the Netherlands, who were the subjects in an ESP experiment. Shields did that with children too. And there was McConnell who reanalyzed Schmeidler data. Van der Kastel used Rorschach to explore personality correlates associated with PK performance, but always there was single isolated studies. It seems that since the 1970s, the Rorschach is no more used as an indicator of psi performance. But it has nevertheless been used marginally to study various exceptional experiences and psychic claimants, near-death experiences, psychokinetic mediums, ESP psychic, possession, mysticism, induced memory of previous life, and coincidence experiences. More recently, for instance, a study has investigated traumatic experiences of 31 people who report recurrent ESP experience using the Rorschach Traumatic Content Index with a control group. In this case, the Rorschach test is used as saying something about personality traits of the participants, but without any explicit connection with a parapsychological dimension. So some people like Martinez Taboas and late Carlos Alvarado have been very critical on the way Rorschach tests may be used in an easy confirmatory manner. I recently explored with a colleague the historical background of the Rorschach Inkblot test on the occasion of its centenary. So the sources of inspiration for this test are multiple, and this historical way to look at this connection is very fecund. The most obvious influence is the psychiatric colleagues of Hermann Rorschach, the founder of the test, Carl Gustav Jung, who built a word association test based on his own study of mediumship. In the context of his PhD, Jung participated in turntable and talking table session with a spiritualist medium. He observed with her, in particular thanks to so-called automatic writing, a whole range of motor and sensory automatism, which allow the depth of the psyche to emerge. And the word association test aims, in fact, at accessing this part of the psyche without going through trance, replaced by a pressure on the mechanism of verbal associativity, which favors a light form of motor automatism. Another influence comes from another Swiss psychoanalyst, the pastor Oskar Pfister, who published a study of cryptography or cryptagon, a procedure that consists of asking patients or normal people in visual-free association to draw, without worrying about it, scribbles in which they discover forms that have strong connection with their most important complexes. The South psychoanalyst Herbert Silberer, who was interested in symbolism, mysticism, and esotericism, published also another article at the same time on lekanomancy. Lekanomancy is a method of divination by inspecting the water in a pool. By focusing the attention on the surface of the liquid, the subject is led to develop sensory automatism that he can interpret as true perception. And the last influence, which is well known, is Simon Hans, who used 8 raw asymmetric black spots and was interested only in the content of the response to assess imaginative function. Nevertheless, despite this psychiatric or psychoanalyst influence, other sources can be identified. And some are more occult. Since antiquity, mantic practice have stimulated sensory on motor automatism. This device, developed by psychoanalysts, are in fact part of ancient tradition, whereas the work of the anthropologists Northcott Whitridge Thomas and Andrew Long, who had identified the presence of similar practice for at least 3,000 years in all known cultures. The water basin, as well as the automatic drawing, were mainly used as supporting semantic practice, where the hallucination thus induced was reinterpreted for divination purpose. So there was kind of two categories of supports which are not completely independent. The first group is the speculum, polished mirrors, pool of water, oil on nails. The principle is to use the optical illusion generated by the reflective surfaces to induce hallucination. And the other group is based on randomness, arrangement of the entrails of a sacrificed animal, flight of released bird, freeing of coins of chopsticks, reading of the lines on the hand, careful examination of coffee grounds. The principle is then to establish a significant link between chance and personal character and destiny. The test established by Hermann Rorschach is a skillful combination of a speculum, thanks to the symmetry, the fixation of the gas on the board, and a random process via the arbitrary shape of the spot. Of course, the Rorschach test is not semantic in the sense that its purpose is not to predict the future, but it's used to uncover personal character and to prognosticate something of the trajectory of one's life, take up some of this heritage. Hermann Rorschach was not unaware of this traditional use of sports. There was a book called Klexographion, written by the physician and poet Justinus Kerner, who earned Rorschach his nickname Klex, which say stain in some way. The principle of this book was simple. A few drops of ink were put on a sheet of paper and then folded in half to obtain a symmetrical spot, a process that can be found in the card designed later by Rorschach. And Kerner thought that this was a way of communicating with the dead while mourning his own wife and waiting for his own death. The technique of extending stains and dandruids associated with poetry was not uncommon in the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon world of that time and will be later reused by the surrealists. And Justinus Kerner was very well known in the spiritualist science because he has worked on the Voyante de Prévost, Voyant of Prévost. At the time when Rorschach reused this process of symmetric ink blot for scientific purposes, it was already charged with many occult connotations. This is a small summary of a lot of tasks or tools that try to induce sensorial or motor automatism, and you can find some that I have already mentioned and some that will come later in my text. So the Rorschach test can be put in that legacy too, but the name of this legacy can be can come from Frederick Myers, who called that psychoscope. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, within the framework of the first dynamic psychiatry and the first Society for Psychical Research, Frederick Myers wrote some of the first essays on automatic writing, and he introduced the notion of autoscope or psychoscope to designate any instrument that reveals a motor impulse or a subliminal sensory impulse. So any device that allows the emergence of motor or sensory automatism is a psychoscope. And he went further by defining what he called the psychoscopic method as the experimental approach par excellence to the human personality. So he proposed that hypnosis, automatic writing on other kind of psychoscope are to psychology what the spectroscope is to the analysis of light. That is, the means of studying the different layers and properties of the psyche. In many ways, the Rorschach test could be included in this family of psychoscope. Motor language and visual automatism are effectively solicited by the attitude of perceptive attention asked of the subjects. Psychology at the end of the 19th century had two paths before it, that of the psychoscope and that of the chronoscope. And the chronoscope was mainly the physiological tools that were used in some laboratory. And the history of psychology then underwent what has been called the discourse of the victor, because chronoscope has won this war and erased any trace of the loser and even the conflict between these two paradigms. But if we go deeper and look at what Myers has done with all his colleagues, there are numerous studies using crystals, balls, or mirrors that test the phenomenon of crystal gazing, but also its auditory counterpart, shell hearing, as when one hears things by putting one ear into a shell. And Myers described a lot of induction procedure, a lot of session, and the way this is a way to trigger incidental imagery and even sometimes some paranormal perception. And Myers reinforced this effect by using post-hypnotic suggestions. I go quicker, but in some way, Myers has also observed that among the vision that emerge in the crystal, some involve forgotten or involuntary memories, but also information about events taking place at a distance or in the future. Unfortunately, there have been no systematic studies of this paranormal aspect, but it is clear here that attempts to psychologize the phenomenon fall back on the divinatory problem. And despite the study that I previously cited here, the crystal vision technique has been under-utilized by subsequent psychological research. However, some have continued to cultivate similar devices, and in the 70s, parapsychological researchers began using the Ganzfeld setting to facilitate extrasensory perception with a continued success. Thus, there is no need for a particular crystal or mirror, simply a homogeneous sensory field that facilitates projections. For subjects, the most difficult part is to sort out their rational anticipation, the flow of their imagination, and the sensory automatism that arise. And there is another recent research on imagery cultivation. There's noise reduction, which also look for psychoanalysis alternatives. Another theoretical aspect is the metapoetic function that emerged from this study. So at that time, they found that the psyche was mainly using four unconscious functions: the conservative function, dissociative, creating function, and the last one was the metapoetic function, which was described first by Myers and taken up by Flournoy and by Bergson. So this function is the way there is for the psyche a continuous fabrication of fiction on myths, which often remains unconscious and appears only if in the dreams, but which can also be expressed on occasion via waking dreams, hypnosis, somnambulism, possession, mediumistic trance, mythomania, hysteria, and delusion. So this is not a surprise to find this metapoetic function in the projective setting, and maybe can reveal a fundamental property of intrapsychic functioning. And one wonders to what extent this function is called upon in the free response ESP protocols. and whether the projective situation itself does not facilitate a parapsychological performance. To conclude, if a reunion between Rorschach test and parapsychology is possible, again, somewhere, it will require the restoration of a complete history that will reintroduce this famous tool in its context, as one of the few psychoscopes to have remained useful until today, both for scientists and for clinicians. The capacity of this test to solicit sensory automatism by playing on the speculum on the randomness, but also motor automatism with its solicitation of a timed language, give it a certain singularity. However, the notion of intrapsychic process has replaced that of automatism, prioritizing the theoretical influence of psychoanalysis over the other influences originally at work. The continuum between fully qualitative approaches and those integrating a maximum of objectification shows that the filiation of the Rorschach test with the psychoscope is not very common in the current literature. One might fear that the international trend is to draw the Rorschach more towards the current scope than the psychoscopes today. We still need a follow-up study to Schmeidler's standalone ones, even if her page on the Science Encyclopedia did not mention at all her work with the Rorschach test. We need to understand if the process-oriented research of personality correlates of Psy can benefit from an assessment of non-conscious factors. Even transliminality as a valuable construct is currently assessed through questionnaires that do not directly involve the transliminal processes themselves. The prolonged controversy on Rorschach test psychomotric properties is part of a historical bifurcation in psychology. This epistemological choice, which either imposes method foreign to its objects or progressively develop original methods that expose the specific problems posed by the human mind on its dynamic function, is really the struggle that we have to face today. And I will thank you for your attention.